Alright, welcome to the channel. My name is James and today we're going to be starting a new 4-part series on how to paint Azrakh. We're going to be covering the red non-metallics today, so let's get into it. Alright, and this is what we're going to be shooting for. This is the final result that you will get at the end of this series, but today we're just going to be looking at the red non-metallic armour. So you'll only need a few paints to achieve this effect. You'll need Mars Black, Titanium White, Primary Red, Crimson, Pale Skin and Dark Violet. I'll list all of these paints below in the description along with the Games Workshop equivalents. So I've created a light map on the model using Mars Black and Titanium White, focusing on the areas where the light will hit. So the outside of the legs, the top of the shoulders, where the face will be, center of the chest, and the areas that you can see. I've then come in with some Primary Red, thinned that down in the airbrush and applied 3 or 4 layers to build up a nice saturated colour. So in the darker areas of the model, we're going to come back in with some Dark Violet and just shoot that into those areas. It's very short bursts, very controlled bursts, just to create some additional colour and interest within the shadows. This will also help to cool them down slightly and create some contrast between the two colours. Now if you don't have access to an airbrush, you can create the light map by dry brushing over those areas and then glazing over or applying a filter of the Primary Red. Once you're all done with the foundation, clean up the trim so you have some context within the model. It can be a bit more difficult if you're working with everything just being the same colour. So we're now going to mix some Pale Skin into our Primary Red, and it's only a very small amount just to start increasing the value so we can start to define the light pattern across the model. So you can see I'm coming in and sort of sketching in different reflection patterns across the model. We're obviously focusing on emphasizing the different shapes within the miniature, so think about whether or not it's a cylinder, a sphere, a flat plane, and those sorts of things whenever you're adding in these highlights. Obviously we want to keep them consistent and keep the light moving in the same direction across all of the different panels. I have thinned down my paint a bit here, so I'm using semi-transparent layers to build this up slowly so I can control the jump in value. Now obviously our goal is to create a lot of contrast across this miniature to really get that shine effect in the armour. So I'm currently using a Series M size 2 to block out the initial highlight pattern across the armour. Again, we're focusing on those areas that we defined in the light map and occasionally just adding in some additional detail to the bounce lights. So like I mentioned earlier, you want to think about the different shapes within the model. So I'm treating the legs basically as just a bunch of cylinders. So I'm trying to create this almost banding effect with my highlights, and it's exactly the same process with the gun. Start picking out some hard edges and hard lines where you can, because that can really help to boost the contrast and create that non-metallic effect across the miniature. I'm doing the same thing with the chain fist. You have to remember there are a number of focal points within this model, obviously the weapons, the face, and a few other components within the armour, so we want to spend a bit of additional time in these areas ensuring that we create the correct lighting pattern and really create a lot of contrast. So I'm also just treating the chest plate as a big cylinder as well, so I'm creating this banding effect more towards the middle because it will draw attention up towards the face. And then picking out those hard edges that frame where the face will be. So we're now adding a bit more Pale Skin into the mix and basically just refining what we did in the previous step. Trying to cover slightly less area, trying to make the layers slightly more opaque, but always thinking about the underlying shape and how we can emphasize that and make it appear more three-dimensional. And you can see I'm working with very controlled brush strokes here. I'm holding the brush pretty far down the ferrule so I can really control the tip. On the outside of the leg, I'm almost adding in a small amount of texture here just to help feather out those blends. I find it just makes it a wee bit easier to create the transitions by doing this. And then just doing the same across the weapons. Now with the gun, you have to remember there's going to be a lot of gold and silver non-metallic in here as well, so we're really defining the light pattern for all of those elements in this step. And again, don't neglect the bounce lights whenever you're doing this. Ensure you're bringing everything up to the same value at this stage. So now I've added a lot more Pale Skin into the Primary Red, and there's a significant jump in value here. as we really create these shine spots within the armour. Now this might seem like a bit of a drastic jump, but we are going to be coming back in with some glazes later to help soften these out and just to help tie everything together. By having this drastic jump in value, it creates that shine and reflective quality that you would expect within non-metallic metals. And you can see I'm really focusing on the edges, really helping to define the shape and where the light might catch. I'm effectively treating this as the light pretty much coming from above, so anywhere that's perpendicular to the light source will be quite bright. Again, just catching those hard edges that are near the face and around the shoulders just helps create a bit more focus in these areas. Whenever it comes to highlighting up the shoulder pads, I'm really just treating those as spheres to try and create that specular reflection point in that area. And then we're just emphasizing those cylindrical reflection patterns within the chest and the other areas across the model. At this point you can kind of play around with the rule of cool as well and add in some additional details or sort of additional reflections within these areas now that we've pretty much established the core shapes and core reflection patterns. Just makes parts of the model a wee bit more interesting and eye-catching. And again in the legs we're almost using that sort of textured brush stroke or that sort of scratching to help introduce some noise and just make the blend seem a wee bit more seamless. So at this point you can kind of see how those reflection patterns are coming together and how the model's starting to look. It's always important whenever you're painting non-metallics to spend a bit of time reflecting, excuse the pun, on how things look whenever you're adding in these additional highlights. And again, exactly the same thing with the weapons, really just bringing up that value, emphasizing that lighting pattern and helping to pick out those details. And I should mention this is mainly focused around the primary reflections now. The secondary reflections or the bounce lights aren't going to be as bright or as intense as this colour or this value. And when it comes to the power fist, think about how the fingers are positioned and whether they're perpendicular to the light source or how the light's going to catch certain edges within this component. And now we're coming in with some pure pale skin and just reinforcing all of those bright highlights that we did in the previous step. Again, we're trying to cover slightly less area with the application of the pale skin. We want to really just bring some focus to each of the individual highlights. Focus on catching those hard edges and anywhere that's perpendicular to the light source. And really reinforce those specular highlights around the shoulders. Now try to keep in mind that some of the other metallic surfaces will be reflecting light onto the shoulders, so that's why I've added that additional highlight around the top of the skull. And then just repeat this process across the rest of the model. Always keep in mind the different shapes that you're trying to accentuate and catching those hard edges that would be reflecting the light. If you're enjoying the video so far, don't forget to hit that like. It really helps to promote the video and helps the channel grow. And if you're feeling frisky, don't forget to give that subscribe a wee slap and a tickle. You can also drop a comment below to help please the algorithm. So now we can start softening out our transitions, and I've taken some crimson here and thinned that down to a glaze consistency. And we're just going to apply this as a filter layer over the highlighted areas. So the reason I've switched to crimson is because I think it gives the armour a more interesting look and creates some distinction between our primary highlights and our secondary highlights. And the reason I didn't start with crimson is because it goes quite pink over white, whereas the primary red holds its intensity and saturation. And whenever you're applying this filter or this glaze, try to pull from the highlights down into the shadows. This way, if you deposit too much paint, it's sort of hidden in all of those darker areas. Once we've applied a couple of layers of crimson, we're going to come back in with the pale skin and just reinforce the brightest points within the highlights, picking out those areas of focus and grabbing those hard edges. Now, whenever you're doing this, think about the different areas of the model and how they all draw towards the main area of focus. Once the head's in place, that's going to be the main area of focus on the model, so we want to ensure that we're accentuating the highlight patterns that create leading lines up towards the face. So we're hitting the shoulders, we're going to be targeting the weapons and the legs, just so it all creates this continuity and these leading lines up into the face. And just to ensure we keep that softness and create smooth transitions through our values, we're going to just apply a nice soft filter of crimson over that again. Again, it just helps to reinforce that crimson color of the armor and helps to create that distinction between the primary highlights and the secondary or bounce lights. And now to reinforce the shadows, we're going to come back in with the dark violet and really just going to push that into the various shadow sections across the model and use it to accentuate some of the highlight areas as well. So you can see how thin the paint is as I drag it across my nail. And our main goal with this filter layer is really just to boost the contrast and boost the shine of the non-metallic. So that's why I'm placing it close to some of these highlight areas, because it creates more contrast by lowering the value beside these super bright high value highlights. And whenever you're building up these shadows, do it over multiple thin passes. The worst thing you can do now is try to be too aggressive and too impatient whenever you're applying these shadows. And use this to create more separation between your primary highlights and your secondary highlights or bounce lights. And then use it to create more contrast around the face as well by pushing it into those recesses or areas of shadow. And with that, your red non-metallic should be pretty much done. Spend some time refining some of your highlights or adjusting some of the shadows in various places until you're happy with the overall result. Just remember, whenever you're making these adjustments, take some time to observe what's happening with the model and think about the overall lighting pattern. Now let's get them on the spinny thing and have a proper look. So this is what your red non-metallic should look like in the end whenever it's combined with the gold and the silvers. I think this creates a really convincing red non-metallic and creates a lot of interest with that mix between crimson, primary red and dark violet. I think this is the perfect combination of colours to create a really intense red and create that old school look to your world leaders. You could even use this recipe for the skin on your demons, greater demons or even your demon primarchs. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you have any comments, questions, or suggestions for future videos, please drop them below in the comments. And if you want to show me what you've been working on, head on over to the Discord and drop some pics into the whips or the completed projects. I'd love to see what you've been painting. If you'd like to get some personalised coaching and tuition, head on over to the Patreon and check out the available packages. There'll be something there to suit everybody. All links can be found below in the description. Thank you again for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll catch you at the next one.